Thanks, Brynella. I also wanted to thank Brynella and Declan for being great hosts and MCs for today. I also wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and given why we're here today, future. I think one of the things that we need to draw from, I think, like Sarah and a couple of others in the room, have had an extraordinary opportunity to travel the world, and I think one of the greatest stories of resilience is from our Aboriginal people here in Australia, and we don't draw upon that as much as we should as a sense of inspiration for children and young people, but certainly we are very lucky that we heard at the very beginning with Ray Davidson about the traditional welcome, but I think as non-Indigenous people, I think we do have the best example of what it is to be resilient and continue, and certainly that's central to a child rights approach. What I wanted to do, I'm starting my stopwatch so I don't go over time. So there's been a lot of theory about child rights over a very long period of time, and I've been lucky to be in organisations that got it wrong a lot, and the pendulum swings one way and completely swings the other. When we were rolling out programs at the very beginning of the convention, it got down to the point where programmers were being told to pick an article in the convention and do programming on it, which of course doesn't make sense. So what we needed to do was to start to talk about people who were delivering programs on the ground, was to say that the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or a rights-based approach, is a way of thinking. And it's the shifting of thinking that's incredibly important. But as Sarah talked about, and I'll continue that, it's also a lens of doing at the same time. What we've got to come to terms with and recognise, for millennia, children have been seen as property. It's very interesting to note that the other major group, there are many groups that have been seen as property, but the other one that we are still working through is that women were seen as property as well, along with children. So women and children were chattel. And you see that still the vestiges of those kind of things happening to women, and certainly with children as well. And I think we need to understand it's a long held belief of human thinking that children are not rights holders, they're actually property. So we can do to them. So doing by, with and on behalf of them is relatively new. So if you look at world history, and we like to think that child rights are not being upheld around the world, and we're kind of okay in Australia, and it's a very old thing. But if you think about the Industrial Revolution, which set the path for the richest nations on earth, was done on the backs of children, because it was the children's little fingers that were in so large-scale child slavery, which was not so long ago. And here in our own country, children have the right to language and culture and family. So I think we need to understand that the Convention lays out a very clear way of thinking, but we don't often hear that a child has a right to their language, a child has a right to their culture, a child has their right to their family. And one of the misconceptions about the Convention on the Rights of the Child is it's antithetical to a family. Well, of course, families are mentioned over and over and over again, and bear the sole primary responsibility for children. And the state is then requested to do everything it can to support parents and guardians in their role of supporting children and young people. It even goes so far as to say, with working parents, the state needs to make sure that it has proper and appropriate childcare facilities. So when you hear the naysayers saying all that child rights approach is anti-family, nothing could be further from the truth. But once again, this is this way of thinking. So we like to think, do we all have rights in this room? So those of us who are over 18, which are many of us, do we have the right to own property? Yes, we do. Do children? No. Is that a problem? Well, it has been. So for example, in the height of the AIDS crisis, there were generations lost. And so children didn't have the right to have property, and so therefore they were losing their houses, their inheritance. So people needed to look back and say, well, hold on, the world doesn't have children as having rights. We don't see them as equal to us. The right to vote is actually incredibly important. I'm often at, as I was yesterday, was anyone at a meeting with me yesterday? Just need to make sure I'm not going to get into trouble. they gave statistics about we really need to worry about those over 65. Really need to worry about 65. So that's the big conundrum that we need to deal with. And their reasoning point was because they're 25%. And I kind of said, I raise you here in New South Wales, a third of the citizens of New South Wales are between 0 and 24. So it's interesting around the notion about there are many unguided, unthinking ways that we discriminate against children. And many meetings people will say, and we'll see your reaction, children should stand up on a train. And you're going to go, why just children? And then they say, but they pay half. And so just in saying that, so this is I'm speaking to the converted because you're here, but that's incredibly important about on a daily basis we're saying things where children are less than, don't have the right to. Children have the right, we all think we've got the right to information to children. Are children talked through in an appropriate way about what's happening to them, what the state may be doing with them, what an NGO may be doing to them? Do we actually take the time and then say, well, hold on, I'm not doing this because it's a good thing, I'm doing this because they have the right to it, because I have the right to it as well. And so it's really about a philosophical approach. And the right to freedom, and we always use, we heard from Tony really early on that to look through the eyes of a child, but think about what it is to be a child. Do you have the right to get to where you're going? No, because you don't have a license, or you may not have the money for public transport. Do you have control about where you are between 7:30 and 3:30? Oh, really? So the whole notion of a child is often people making other decisions about very basic things. So their ability to actually play a role in those. So for example, school, and for children playing a role at school, but they are compelled by law to be at school. We're not compelled by law to be here or be at work. I'm not saying it's a wrong thing that they're compelled, I'm just saying to get back into the notion of they're in a situation on a daily basis where they're being told that they have not a clear sense of control. And the right to children have the same right to violence, the same right to be free from violence than adults do. And in fact, if you look at law, that's not the case. In fact, our laws separate out that you can perpetrate a particular kind of violence against children, but for another day. So what I wanted to look at here is that we always talk about moving from a charity model to a rights-based model, and it can sometimes say yes, 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 that makes sense. But I think we really need to understand is the deserving poor. And particularly for those people at frontline services and have been working, I was lucky enough to be at ACOS, and so we were working with the welfare lobby all the time, but you can see in government policy, the deserving poor. So you've got to help them not because they have the inherent right to lead a particular kind of life like the rest of us do, but we've got to get something back from them. And so the charity model, the NGO model, began from the charity approach. And it's changing and evolving, but we've got to be mindful of seeing children as rights holders and mindful of the fact, are we doing what we think is a good thing and feeling good about it, or are we saying, actually I'm doing this because they've got the right to do it in the first place? And what struck me about this was people have needs which should be met, and those needs need to be prioritised. Sounds okay, right? You heard that in a meeting, there's a need to be met, let's prioritise it. It's very different to say, actually they've got the right for that need to be met. And the other thing if you look at this one, people affected by development or programming work are passive beneficiaries. They can be invited to participate in order to improve the effectiveness of programs. Once again, that sounds okay, right? You hear that all the time. It's very different under a rights-based approach to say that we are the people that we are doing programs to is actually we are doing programs with, and that you see the beneficiaries or the client or the citizen as a partner in the process. It makes for better programming, but it's also that notion of, but they've got the right in the first place. So from a programming point of view, makes good sense, but it's a different mindset to say, actually, we're not doing to them, It's by, with and on behalf of them. And so it really is mostly about a philosophical approach when we do programming. And programming could be an advocacy campaign, it could be a direct service, it could be many things. We've heard about 2, 3, 6 and 12, so our team here is going to get a test on it afterwards. You see we're meeting today in the Article 12 room, which is the participation room. The components of child rights programming, Sarah talked about them a bit, but the things I want to highlight, she highlighted participation, so I won't go there in great detail. When you're an NGO, and having spent most of my life in NGOs, is that the vision and mission of an NGO doesn't say, I will accept money on behalf of government to do a particular program. It actually says, I want to improve the lives of children. We want to make a fundamental difference to the particular population group that the organisation was set up for. That means you could be an advocacy organisation if you look at your constitution. So one of the fundamental things about it is being the duty bearer, which is talked a lot about this morning, but who's responsible? And I think, particularly from a programming point of view, whether it's within government or within NGOs, or a combination of both, is that if you're finding that there is a problem that can be solved by change of policy, then you're duty bound to do that. And that frontline workers are the foot soldiers to ensure that we're getting that right information. Obviously, first and foremost, you talk to children and young people and ask them. But the reality is, in terms of child rights programming, you also have the obligation to say, well, we need to work with our client base, or the people that we're doing the program by, with and on behalf of. But you also need to say, what you're also in the privileged position, you also have the obligation if there are wider systemic issues. And that's as easy as in your staff meetings, spending 5 minutes saying, has anyone got some problems that we haven't talked about? So for example, you could be working in Western Sydney and someone says, oh, well, I've got a case where a New Zealand client of mine under the age of 18 can't get medical assistance. And then someone says, actually, I have that problem too. And so therefore you would then say, you take it up the chain, you come to ACYP, you go to your peak organisations, you go directly to government and say, this is a problem that's being occurred. But if we don't take a reflective moment within a staff meeting to say, are there any issues that we're not talking about? Is there something we need to reflect on? Which once again is that notion about looking systemically about protecting children's rights. Sarah's gone through those a bit. So what I wanted to concentrate on was two things. One, which was a child rights situation analysis, which was Sarah talked about, but ultimately it's about good planning. But before that point, I wanted to talk about the best interests, which is the key. They talk about that's the golden rule of the convention. And we often don't get this right. So when you're working for an organisation, and if your client is a child or young person, then your job as a duty bearer is to say, at this moment, what is in the best interests of this young person in front of me? Where so many decisions start with what's for the needs of the family. Not. Now, for most children, in most circumstances, and the convention backs this up, we need to ensure that there's connection to family and culture and all these other things. But in that moment, you need to be thinking about, well, what's in the best interests of this young person? And that's once again a retraining, because we often say what's in the best interests of the family rather than the best interests of the child, and it can change. And it's the best part of doing work with children, because children are complex as any other population group. And within that, once again, that it is not read that this is anti-family or anti-community. Their fundamental rights, I'll say it again, is the right to family, culture, language. So, but for the young person in front of you, what's in their best interest at that moment when they're in front of you? I would say UNHCR and UNICEF, when I was at UNICEF, was in long battles with UNHCR about what the rights mean, and it's a complicated discourse. But I think they do the best version of the best interest determination. It's particularly set up for, you probably can't read all of that, it's particularly set up for when they're screening refugee children and young people. But firstly, it talks about the views of the child. So are we doing that in our practice? So if children are being moved, if there's a decision being made about a young person, are they actually spoken to? In the work that we've done here in the office, no, not always. Where fundamental things, where they live, where they go, which city they're in, are their views taken into account? Not always. The other thing is do no harm, which used to be one of the golden principles in child rights discourse, is no longer. Don't know why that's the case. But that's about safety. So sometimes having a child being involved in a decision-making process, once again in their best interests, you may actually increase their sense of risk. That doesn't mean you don't get their views and they're not included, but you need to be thinking through. And the most obvious examples of that is when you're talking to children and young people in war zones, which I did a fair bit of, sometimes showing that you're going and talking to some children in a circumstance visually actually puts them at risk. When we spoke to thousands of young people in war and conflict using that, they said they didn't talk about the torture or the rape or the burning of their villages. What they talked about was separation from family, was their number one thing. It's a universal thing. And family should also be seen as siblings, about keeping young people connected to culture. And the last thing is development and identity needs. Sarah talked a lot about evolving capacity, which is true, but I'd say that's pretty true of adults. About evolving capacity, about understanding things, but we need to say that the same, give children the same latitude. But you can see there there's a right to culture and the right to thrive. So that's a daily thing you can go through, it's a strategic planning process you can go to, but ultimately is the golden rule of the convention, is everything I'm doing and saying in the best interest of the young person in front of me, but for us here at the office, is this in the best interests of children and young people in the state? So a little known role that we have in the office, and I have to say thank you to my team, is that we have to input back on every single thing that goes through cabinet. So we're in the practice every day is it in the best interest of children and young people? So it's alive. It makes the work very interesting, but it's also something for you to continue to do on an ongoing basis. The child rights situational analysis, once again, there's lots of theory about this to make it complicated. And going on from our other speakers, what this is, and when we do our advocacy training, the reality is we don't define the problem particularly well. So we assume we know what, usually when we make decisions in NGOs or in government, we're sometimes a solution in search of a problem. Rather than to say, let's take a big step back, what is the situation for children and young people if that's how you're programming? So you need to be thinking at what's the social, cultural and economic lens that you need to be going through. What's the cultural context? So it's very easy to extrapolate that, but you can apply it here in Australia. But what's the cultural context in relation to? So when you're in different countries, there's cultural context, there's lots of traditional practices in many developing countries where you work with them. But so a good example was in Laos, there was a traditional practice of tying the umbilical cord with a special blessed cord from the temple. And so what was that? We were looking at a problem, there were lots of children dying in relation to this practice because, does anyone guess what was the problem? The cord wasn't sterilised. So rather than throw out the cultural practice, so this was the situational analysis, what is the culture, what's important. So obviously the involvement of the temple and the religion was important to the community and for children. So we then worked with the local religious organisations and they incorporated the sterilisation of the cord as part of the practice. So looking at these kind of lenses, you need to, what's important to the community, what's the culture that's in, and what are the bad things in the culture that you need to be looking at. So the cultural practices here, what's our cultural practice about inclusion of particular children? What's our cultural practice about how we deal with Aboriginal children and young people across the state? So we hear that every day from Aboriginal children here in New South Wales around their number one issue is racism. If you're not doing that kind of analysis when you're running programs, if young people, so we first went out to young people said to us who were Aboriginal, many of the same issues that all young people talk about, but there were two issues that were different. One, which was the level of racism that they deal with on a daily basis. So if we're programming and we're developing programming and we're not addressing that, A, if we're not addressing that in our own organisations, B, if we're not looking at this is what children are saying, but fundamentally that's the situational analysis of which our programs sit in, then our programs are not going to be as successful. And what's the legal framework? So you need to think, is there a law, or what are the laws that protect children? In many cases, our laws are okay. It's mostly about implementation. But if you're saying, well, I'm a small organisation, I can't do this, you have the convention reporting process, you have the officers of the, you've got our strategic plan and the feedback from children and young people, you've got your other NGO colleagues, you've got NCOS and many other peak bodies to think through what are the macro issues that we need to be thinking about first. So not a solution in search of a problem, but what are the problems and what's the situation that children and young people sit in. And it sounds pretty simple, but it's amazing how different your work can be. So we heard about the situation in Africa. So once again, one of those things is a power and gender analysis. For children and young people, so once again, the rights of women and the rights of children have been inextricably linked for centuries, and in fact, all the forerunners of the rights-based agenda were women, and all the forerunners of the child rights agenda were both suffragettes separately and advocates for children and young people. So Eglantine Jebb, the founder of Save the Children, was both a suffragette in her spare time, but a full-time job was to set up Save the Children and write the first Declaration of Human Rights. Amazing story. The first woman to write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, does anyone know who it was? Eleanor Roosevelt. So they're inextricably linked, but in gender analysis with children, and sometimes what we struggle with is that boys may grow up to be part of the patriarchy, at their later levels will be the patriarchy, but they're equally victims when they're children and young people too. So when we look at education, having that gender lens about doing the homework is that in Africa it's very true that the statistics bear out that the subjugation of women, but particularly girls, is a fundamental problem in education. But does anyone know what the trend is in Latin America? It's now trending the other way. So more girls are attaining high school degrees. And so with UNICEF and many of the other NGOs, people had to go, oh, what does this mean? Which doesn't stop about realising the rights of the girl, but it means when you're looking at children, there's a gender analysis. When you look at violence, there is violence perpetrated against all children. So all children are subject to sexual violence. All children. All children are subject to physical violence, meaning as a group, meaning no matter what age you are, what gender you are, what ethnicity you are, what race you are, girls are more likely at a global perspective to suffer from sexual violence than boys, but the number with boys globally is 1 in 6. Boys are more likely to be subject to the abuses of child labour than girls, but still there are 30 million girls subject to child labour. So I think we need to think with our programming with the gender lens. Is it affecting boys and girls the same? Sometimes it is. Is it affecting girls differently? Is it affecting boys differently? What do we need to do? So in the child rights analysis, just as a steps approach, you need to see what are their rights not being realised, and then you say, as a programmer, I know the program response to this, and then the other thing is I know the laws that need to change. So the advocacy and programming cycle begins exactly at the same point, which is about what's going on in the society. Because if you're not looking at the underpinning issues, then in fact you could be doing a great intervention, but in some countries if we do a lot of assistance around school, but the problem is that children are going to school where teachers are not turning up and those teachers aren't qualified, then whatever after school program you're doing or before school program you're doing is not actually helping the problem. So you really need to kind of stand back and have a look. So just very quickly, say making a plan for the situational analysis, and as Sarah talked about, that's the notion of involving children and young people from the very beginning. You can do that in a direct service, but there are many organisations collecting the views of young people, so annual peaks. So don't often feel like that as an organisation in your own service, you have to go out and speak to every single young person. It's actually about, can we get the views from enough young people? And I think it's much easier than people think. And we would say all the time, we've been lucky enough to sit down with around 5,000, we think, or maybe it's less, I don't know. But that's because we're on planes, trains and automobiles and go out to where children are and ask them. But for those of you in direct service, they're there. And so there are ways that you can incorporate in your own modelling and your own processes where you do include the voices of children. And Sarah talked about no organisation I've seen has done this well, other than child-led organisations. Do people know what that term means? It's a very development international term. We don't have as many of those in Australia. So child-led organisations is where children who are former child labourers gather together in their own organisation. So they control it, they run it, and so you support them. There are examples in Australia, but not as many outside. So when they talk about child-led, they mean organisationally, so the organisation's run by children. I think it means here child-led is that we'll train up young people to do the consultations. But child-led organisations is even a step further. I'm just checking on time. I'll stop there. But it's important to know that within New South Wales, we actually have a lot of the legislative framework. So best interests is throughout our laws. Within many parts of our legislation, we are requested to talk to children and young people. But it's about all of you actually ensuring that you're a duty bearer, and so that when you're following groups of young people, children and young people, or you're doing individual advocacy, is to ensure that their voice is heard and that the decisions are in their best interest. So thanks very much.